Okay, this is chapter 1, part 4 out of 5. The first 2 slides you may not even see on the PowerPoint that I posted. And that's because I'm really not going to test you on any of this. This is just to give you kind of a basic understanding of some of this anatomical terminology and the fact that about 90% of these medical terms have Greek and Latin roots. And some word elements, scientific terms, acronyms, all of these things. It's really up to you whether or not that you want to kind of go over this to see if this will help you. But in future lessons and labs, it's really going to help you the more familiar you become with this language of anatomical or medical terminology. So now, here's one difference between my seated classes and this form. The next slide, what I would be talking about would be how I would talk about the relationship of both of my hands. And I would be moving my hands as I was talking. At one point, both of my hands would be down by my side. And then in the next second, I would raise one of my hands and then kind of ask, how would we talk about the relationship of the hands to certain body parts if that hand keeps moving? And that just leads us to this anatomical position part, that we have to agree on this anatomical position. And this is the position, regardless of the position of the patient or the model. When we talk about the relationship of body parts, we always do so from the anatomical position. So you absolutely need to know what this anatomical position is. All right. Body erect, feet slightly apart, palms facing forward, and the thumbs have to be pointing away from the body. So that is the anatomical position. That is one of the first things that you have to understand and get down pat. So now what we're going to be doing is we're going to be breaking up into major body regions and then talking about anatomical terms, directional terms, and those sorts of things. So first we have these major body regions. We have the axial region, and then we have the appendicular region. So the axial region consists of the head, neck, and trunk. And then the appendicular are just going to be the upper and lower limbs. When we get to bones, you see that I break up my bones list into an axial region and appendicular. And it's going to be beneficial for you to understand by, say, take a look at the axial skeleton or the appendicular. You already have an idea of what parts you're going to be talking about. So there are various terms for each part of the body, and you need to know these. I'm not concerned if this is the exact image or list that is in your textbook. There might be some slight differences. I know which ones are repeated. So in your textbook, there is going to be an image like this. It might not be actual models. It might be a figure. But regardless, you need to start to know these terms, okay? So you need to know axillary is the term for armpit. Brachial is arm. Cubital is elbow. I'm going to actually, surprisingly, add one here that's not shown. Antecubital is just going to be the front of the elbow, okay? So carpal is wrist, so on and so forth. So my recommendation is make note cards for these. Students have a tendency to make note cards for everything. Note cards are great if you just want to memorize something. I would make note cards for these anatomical terms and then study them. If you're a morning person, go over 5 of those flashcards every single morning. If you're a night person, go over 5 flashcards every single night. And if you do that from now until the test, you wouldn't have devoted any specific study time to knowing these terms, and you will have them down pat. This is dangerous for me to say, but the number of questions I'm going to put on the exam about this don't match the volume of terms that you have to know. But if you don't know these terms, bones, muscles, everything that follows is going to be more difficult. So this is the language. And so just make sure that you start to get this down. I'm also just taking a quick look. I see one other thing that's missing, and this might be in the image in your textbook. Here, lower lateral leg is either called fibular or peroneal. Okay, so that's lower lateral leg is fibular or peroneal. All right, so those are the anatomical terms that you need to know. Now we have directional terms. Directional terms, superior means above, inferior below, anterior and posterior. We can also say ventral and dorsal, right, because we're a bipedal organism. Just keep in mind that if we're talking about a tetrapod, a cat, anterior is towards the front and ventral is going to be belly side. So there is a difference between anterior and ventral, but for a human, we can use them interchangeably. The ones that I want you to star in your notes is proximal and distal. These are the ones that students have the most problems with. So after you go over these directional terms and you think you have it down pat, go over them again and make sure that you understand proximal versus distal. Proximal is closer to the point of attachment. Distal is further away. Okay, so the elbow is going to be proximal to the wrist, right? Because the elbow is closer to the point of attachment than the wrist is. The wrist is going to be distal to the elbow. So you might want to go over that a couple of times, and feel free to shoot me an email if you want me to kind of take a look at. I would recommend go over some body parts and then just to talk about their relationship. The other point too that I want to make is we could say in this anatomical position that the knee is superior to the ankle. That is not how it's done though, and I will mark it wrong if you try and describe that. When we're talking about appendicular, we always use proximal and distal. Okay, so just keep that in mind. And I would recommend, again, going over knee to the ankle or knee to the foot, so on and so forth. If you want to come up with a couple of them, shoot me an email or put it on Blackboard. That would be fine. Here's just another view of the same thing. Proximal and distal is still here. Medial and lateral. Medial is going to be towards the midline. Lateral is further away from the midline. Superficial, more towards the surface. Deep is deep, further away from the surface. Okay. Central and peripheral, it's not used too much except for the nervous system more than anything else. Here this says peripheral, central versus lateral and medial. I'm not too concerned about this. Again, lateral and medial is what is used more often than not. If you get into specific organs like the kidney, sure, that's when you would start to use central. I really haven't come across talking about parts of an organ. So I'm really not going to concentrate on the peripheral versus central. All right, body planes. We have these various planes. A plane is an imaginary line that goes through the body, and a cut or a section is an actual cut that is done. So we have sagittal. Sagittal is a plane that divides into right and left parts. And actually, what I'm going to do, I would recommend you guys just keep it on this. You have the PowerPoints. Keep it on this. Keep looking at this. I'm just going to go ahead to the image and then kind of go over this. Okay. So you can pause it now to write this stuff down if you so choose. I'm going to jump ahead and still cover this on the next slide. So sagittal is where we cut something into right and left parts. Here's a big one though. Mid-sagittal means that they are equal. Parasagittal means that they are unequal. The biggest mistake students make is when they hear sagittal, they automatically think it has to be mid-sagittal, and it does not. If I tell you that there is this sagittal cut, all you know is that it's left and right. You have no idea if it's mid or para. So please keep that in mind. A frontal plane will divide into anterior and posterior parts, or ventral and dorsal. A transverse plane, also known as a cross section, will give us superior and inferior, and what's not shown here is an oblique. If you notice, all of these planes that are listed here are at 90 degrees. They're perpendicular to all the other planes. An oblique section is any one that is not. So it has to be at an angle. That is all. It can be a very slight angle. It can be a very sharp angle, right? But as long as it is not perpendicular to any of these other planes, then that will be an oblique section. The next two slides are more just to give you an idea of something that you might come across later on. I'm just kind of introducing this notion to you, is that sagittal, frontal, and transverse cross sections. Here, these are examples of kind of different body parts. But keep in mind, on this next slide, you can see that there will be that there can be dramatic differences from one section to the next of the same organ. So it's just something that you have to try and get used to. One of the things that we're going to do in lab is that we'll talk about some anatomical structures with a sagittal section, and then we may talk about some that are in a cross section. So again, just keep that in mind. I'm going to give you 3-4 seconds to pause this. This is just some practice. Again, the biggest thing to keep in mind is that when you're talking about anything that is going to be appendicular, just know that you have to be talking about proximal versus distal. All right. So you can give this a try, and then if you want me to take a look at it, that's fine. And then we're just going to end with anatomical variability. This isn't something that I'm really going to hold you to, that I'm going to test you on, but just understand that when we go over these structures, that there is going to be some variability from person to person. But overall, extreme anatomical variations are seldom seen. The biggest ones that we'll see is blood vessels, the vasculature of the digestive, and even then we see it's typically one of a few different plans, if you will, that we can see, all right, most of the people are either going to have this type of vasculature or this one, as an example. So that there is just some variability. That's more of just an FYI. All right. And this is the end of part 4. One more part after this.